Welcome to the Mobile Hunters Dojo, a community helping hunters reach their full potential in the woods and in life. I'm your host, Matt Lear. Come on in, kick off your shoes, and take a seat on the mat as we develop a mindset for success, forge self-discipline, practice the art of continuous improvement, and hone our craft. Welcome back to the dojo, everyone. I'm your host, Matt Lear. And here we are. It's July. The clock is ticking down. And I don't know about you, but man, I feel behind the eight ball. I've got a lot of stuff going on. And not just like out in the woods. I've got stuff at home. I got to get a honey-do list, finished up here because the season's going to be here before we know it. I'm actually going to Nebraska. I got drawn for it. And heading down there for a week at the opener. And then it's just one trip after another after that. And got to get ready for it all. So kind of feeling behind the eight ball, especially here in Michigan. I just haven't gotten out and did the scouting like I've done, in the past. And really, I've got 2 cameras out, I think, out in Illinois and nothing else anywhere. So really behind the eight ball on stuff. But anyways, hopefully you're a lot further than me. If not, then get out there. I'm going to get out there. I'm going to fight the bugs. I'm going to fight the ticks. And I'm going to get some cameras hung and definitely getting some glassing in because it's that time of year. I'm pretty pumped up about that. Feeling like my glassing game is, stepping up a little bit this year. I've got myself, a phone scope, and I'm excited to get out there and record some velvet. So this week, I'm super excited because we are starting a new series that's going to run probably into the middle of August. And this series is going to cover different terrain and different regions of the country. Man, I have got a killer lineup for you guys because you guys actually helped me create it. I put out some questions and people gave me who like their top hunters are in those different terrains. And I'll release a post here with the upcoming podcast, but let's get to this one. I'm super pumped for this. I've got DJ Riley here at the dojo, and you may have heard of him. Not only is he a big buck killer here in Michigan, but he is also the host of a podcast called the Method Podcast, and it's one of the most popular podcasts out there right now. It's one that I listen to every time it drops, and DJ came to the dojo to break down swamps for us. So without further ado, and I say this every time, but I'm serious, get out a notepad and pen because he drops some great info, and super appreciative of him making the time to come here and do this. And I honestly think he gave us his best stuff. So without further ado, let's jump in with the method man, the swamp doctor himself, DJ Riley. So we just got off the weekend. How was your 4th of July weekend, man?
Man, 4th of July weekend, it was great because leading up until the 4th of July weekend, honestly, we were down in Cincinnati, Ohio. My girls had dance nationals down there. And so we got back on like the Sunday, so that was like the last day of June. And then July 1st was a Monday. So we kind of rolled right into kind of honestly, like it was a little bit of almost a full 2-week vacation, but it was good. We headed up north for a few days. We have a place up on Higgins Lake. And so it's always a good time to get up there, but boy, it's always so busy for the 4th of July. My girls love the tube and out there in the water, and we make sure we get out there and do that. But if there's one weekend where it's like you really got to stay on top of what you're doing and watch a lot of other people around you, that's it, man. But it was a good weekend. And, I think with a lot of people, you kind of come off that weekend where it's like, okay, we did the holiday, we did all that family stuff, and then you start really gearing into the whitetail summer work, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I felt like the timer just like almost sped up. I think the timer's always been going, and I feel behind always on my task list for what I'm doing for whitetail. But as soon as July 4th hit, it seems like it like just speeds up, and now I'm trying to get out and get more glassing done and trying to get through my list. So
yeah, it's funny that you brought up that you said that you felt maybe you're behind, and that is something that I've always battled. Whether it's, postseason scouting, my summer glassing, trail cameras, or even going into season, I've always had that feeling of like, man, did I do enough? Did I get all my stuff done? but I've also along the way, I've kind of learned where it's like, I almost have this thought in my head that if I was going into season and I was like, I have everything done, I don't have anything to do, then I almost feel like I'd be complacent, almost like, like I don't think it would feel right, like, because to me, it's like, it's never done. Like, there's always something else that could be, get 1% better.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. We at the dojo, one of our pillars that holds up our mission is continuous improvement. And it's there because I don't think guys who really live, breathe, sleep, I mean, this is our DNA, this is what we do. I don't think there is ever a time that you could get through that list, because that list is
Hmm.
always going to grow without you even knowing it, because it's that constant push to get better.
Hmm.
So I mean, it's a stress. I actually like the stress. I like having this a little bit of like healthy, man, I got to get it done, because it just drives you more, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I tell you what, man, like I said, over the years, I've like accepted like that I actually kind of want to feel that way because, dude, it used to drive me, and I'm sure it drove my family crazy too years ago, where it'd be like, all of a sudden, it was, back in the day, I thought there was this hard line of when green up started, like I couldn't scout anymore, and I would, I'd try to jam a bunch in at the end, and then all of a sudden that would lead right into the trail camera stuff. And then all of a sudden it was right at the end of summer. It was like, oh my gosh, like I didn't check them enough, or now it's just like, no, it's just part of the game. You just got to take the ebbs and flows with it, basically.
Yeah, yeah. I feel actually where I got kind of crazy was in season, because
Hmm.
I just felt like, I wasn't making enough moves. And for me, it was a little bit more wrapped up to like I had to get it done, and
Mm.
it wasn't enjoying the process. And once I
Yeah.
switched to enjoying the process, that little bit of stress like is welcomed. And now that's not tied to identity. It's much more enjoyable. My family loves it a lot more now too. They're like not stressed
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. And I hear that because I used to have FOMO really bad during hunting season, and that was more like that was a lot when I was younger. And the FOMO was not being able to hunt enough. That's what I feared is not being out there enough, And I'll be honest, Matt, like those days, I can remember when I was younger, like I was probably a jerk at home on those days that I was feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm missing out. I'm missing out. Where now, like I look back at those days where it's like, man, I hunt a lot less now, but I kill a lot more than what I ever did back in the before, and but I'm not the only one that notices it because my wife always brings it up too, where she's like, she was like, you don't have to be out there all the time because you still kill them without being out there all the time.
Yeah, my wife has been like, it's weird. We went through phases where it's like, hey, you're out there way too much, and you're right. Like I had the whole FOMO thing going on, miserable out in the woods, and then it got balanced, and I was started to pull back. And now that our kids are getting older,
Hmm.
and it's like she's like, go, like you have the
Yeah.
time, you can kind of go out there a little bit more now. So it's this fun little support that she's kind of switched on, and it's been great for us as long as I keep it balanced. So it makes me like, right now, one of the lists that I'm behind on is like honeydew list, like
Yeah.
I, because she's supporting me like crazy out there during the fall season. So I'm like, all right, what do you want painted? What are we gonna get done?
Yep.
And that's all last weekend. That's what I was doing. But
Yeah. I tell you what else before we move on here, Matt, is you brought up the point about that, once you and learn to love the process and enjoy the process of it, like you felt like that pressure was gone. And for someone that's new, just getting into hunting, I think that is so important. Like I've kind of talked about over the years, and I know every guy's situation is a little bit different, but man, when I step back and look at it from like 100,000 foot view, and I watch guys and you see them like feel pressure, and some of the pressure I get it, like it's self-induced, like you want to get it done, but man, I just can't help but think it's like if you're feeling a ton of pressure out there just to kill an animal, like a lot of times I think that guys almost need to take a step back and think about why they're even doing it in the first place, because we all started doing it when we were young because we loved it and it was a ton of fun. That meant you got to spend some time with grandpa or your uncle or your dad or grandma, whoever it may be. And it's like when you take a step back and not feel that pressure and do things how you want to do them on your own terms and enjoy the entire process of it. man, I think that's when it becomes so much more enjoyable. And honestly, that's kind of when things like you probably are naturally slowing things down at that same time. It's when things start to kind of fall in place for you too. But I love that you brought that up because man, I think in anyone that says they haven't dealt with that is probably lying because we've all felt that pressure before. You know, like oh my buddies are killing them, or I got to kill one for a video, or whatever the case. My job is in the hunting and is all of that shit. Where it's like, man, if you feel that pressure, just take a step back and think about why you're really doing this.
Yeah, and if you're listening to yourself right now and you feel like you have that pressure, go back and re-listen to what he just said. I mean, that is gold right there. I think that right there will free people up to actually kill more deer than anything
Mm-hmm.
else, because when you get that freedom, like for some reason, everything starts to like kind of like get unsnagged and things start
Mm-hmm.
to make sense. I think you just have a clearer mind and you can
Yep.
go in and see things differently with a clearer mind. It's weird and it's hard for people to really just take that serious. They want to hear the tactic and they want to just teach me what I got to do so I can kill the buck. That's it right there,
Yeah.
actually. Because
Yeah.
then you'll enjoy the process.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest hangups, especially for me early on in not just my hunting career, but when I really wanted to get into chasing the bigger caliber bucks, and I know that was my biggest hang up is I was trying to do things just like everyone else was, or I was trying to do things because of how it looked. You know, I seen someone else do it, so I tried to be just like that. And still today, I think for a new hunter getting in there, like if you just hunt how you want to hunt, you can take a little bit of everyone's style, make it your own style, or whatever the case may be, but truly like doing things how you want to do them when you want to do them, like success will eventually come if you keep after it.
Yeah, I agree. So today we have you on because the idea was to go through over the next month and a half, and just cover different terrains. I started thinking to myself, like, I love to travel. And there's been so many times where, for me, I'm comfortable with just jumping in the truck, heading to a different state, hitting a whole new terrain I've never, walked into before. But I also know that, I've got a little bit more freedom in the later years. I'm older than most, I think, that I interview, and my kids are older, so I can go do that. And if I'm not successful, I can go back later. I can figure it out. I've
Yeah.
got a little bit more time around this thing. But for the guy who has 1 week, and or maybe very limited vacation, and he wants to make, the best of his trip out to a new area, I wanted to cover different terrains, and I wanted to get people that not only that I think, but also my listeners thought were really the experts on these areas. And I view you as an expert, definitely in the swamp game and other games too. But I wanted to bring you on and kind of start off by giving an overview, kind of what would I need to know and understand about swamps if I'm just showing up for the first time before I walk in as a new guy. What would you say are like, hey, this is what makes swamps different than maybe hardwoods or different terrains that you've hunted?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate the kind words, Matt. They mean a lot. And I will say before we dive into all the swamp things, there are a couple things. No two swamps are the same because I in not only have I seen it, it's just something I believe because no two properties are the same. So every swamp can be a little bit different. And what I talk about today, it may not be right and it may not be wrong. It's what I've learned, and I'll tell all of your listeners. Most of all these lessons have come from failure. You know what I mean? So along the way, I've failed a lot of times and learned some of these swamps of how they work. But so at the base level, when I think of a swamp, I think a lot of people, like even in this podcast here, we're going to talk about swamps just individually. But there's a lot of things about swamps that I think relate to other terrains also. They're just in a different category. Like the label on them is a little bit different. So at a base level, let's think of a swamp as a rectangle. We're going to try to paint people the best picture we can. So at the very long lines of the rectangle, at the top of it is the north side, and at the bottom of it is the south side. So everyone paint a really good picture. Now, the thing about a swamp is there's edges all the way around it eventually. Now, what determines that is how big it is, right? And what is it butting up to? A lot of the swamps I hunt, they kind of butt up to either farm ground, cattail marshes, or hardwoods. But either way, there's still an edge there. Okay. Now, if you were walking into the woods today in the middle of July here, it's going to be thick in there. But you should even be able to tell that that swamp's even going to be thicker, like visually, whether it's that hardwoods edge to the swamp edge, because that means you're into that wood cover quite a bit. There's still going to be a hard edge there. So that's the important thing about a swamp is you got to always remember, to me, these whitetails are such an edge animal. So there's always an edge there. Eventually, maybe that swamp runs into a road and then the swamp continues on the other side of the road. Either way, there's still an edge. But what happens with these swamps is, so, I talked about a rectangle, and obviously they're not a perfect shape rectangle. But let's say this. Let's say on the southwest corner of that swamp, instead of it like a perfect square edge of a rectangle, maybe that's rounded. Okay. Maybe that's rounded right there. And when it comes off that rounded edge, maybe the swamp goes in a little bit right there. So naturally to me, when I start seeing breaks in the swamp, because that's the number one thing that I'm attracted to is breaks in the swamp, something that it's not monotonous. There's some difference in it. If that swamp, let's say we have a or a hardwoods edge to a swamp edge, and we're down there on that southwest corner, and all of a sudden, you're on that west side, and now you're coming around to that south side, and it's rounded. But then all of a sudden, the swamp kind of goes in there right there. Well, to me, now that corner, not only is it a corner, we have one edge, now we have two edges right there. Now that corner is almost like a finger. Okay, when I look at that finger and how like you could think about it in hill country, it's basically a point on a ridge, just jetting out there. But what the real important part is like when that swamp makes that break and it kind of goes in a little bit. That in is very similar to what guys talk about to me, hubs in hill country. Because when that swamp, if it goes in, if that edge breaks into the swamp more, goes up into that bedding more, it's a great place for scent and thermals to sit there and just swirl right there. And I know I kind of got deep on like just one spot of that swamp, but if I was a new guy and I was wanting to learn a swamp, I'm going to take that rectangle I just talked about and walk those edges and look for two things. Either areas that the land goes into the swamp more, there's a break in it, or areas that the land comes out of the swamp more. Any type of break in that edge, a natural one, a lot of times the one that's I think is very overlooked that I've keyed in a lot over the last decade is these swamps. A lot of times here in Michigan, at least, we have a bad thing called emerald ash borer. And so we have a lot of dead ash trees, and boy, we'll have some really, really big downfalls on the edges of these swamps, or maybe just inside. And if those downfalls break that edge where that hardwoods meets that swamp edge, that could create a really good break, and it also enforce those whitetails to do something. Because the reason I'm looking for these breaks in the swamp is what I've learned is just outside that swamp edge, say in the hardwoods, and just inside the swamp edge where the bedding is, there's usually two parallel trails, one on the outside, one on the inside. Okay. And those parallel trails will follow that swamp. Like if that's a rectangle, say we're on that south side of that rectangle, they'll follow that thing the whole way. But every time I've learned this from scouting, every time I've walked all these trails, whenever there's a break in that swamp edge, that is where the exit and entry trails are. And that is where like I drop I use onX mapping probably the most out of all of them. And my most common waypoint I use is the junction waypoint on there. And they are getting dropped on the edges of those swamps where when I see a junction, to me, that's two or more trails coming together. And if I took you out there and I showed you every junction, you would say, DJ, every one of these junctions are on a break of a swamp edge, because that's what they do. That's what a whitetail does. there's an advantage there to some point, whether it's wind, thermals, or visual there. There's a reason that they use those breaks in the swamps.
So with those parallel trails that you were talking about,
Hmm.
how are they using those? You said there's one on the outside and one on the inside.
Yep.
Can you explain how they're being used?
Yeah, so they're going to be used at different times of the year. And maybe I should have even started with this about the swamps is these swamps are, they can change. They change every day. I mean, literally, if you go 3 days without rain, they're going to change. You get one good rainfall, they're going to change. So there's areas that there's some swamps that I don't technically have to go check the water levels all the time. I know nearby swamps that I can go glass from afar, say from a truck, to watch those swamp levels because those parallel trails are going to change with the swamp water because that's going to dictate how far they're in. Because the whitetails don't necessarily want to have to live in those swamps. They live in there because they're forced to live in there by the human pressure, or like even if you got real bad coyote pressure in the area, like they'll push them into those swamps too. But what happens? Let's just say you're a new guy and kind of like the what you talked about in the very beginning. Maybe you had 10 days to go hunt and you're in swamp country and we'll even paint a picture of it. It's November 8th. Okay. And we have a northwest wind and we have this rectangular shaped swamp. Okay. So a northwest wind is going to put a buck that we're trying to hunt on that south side of that swamp. Okay. And he's probably going to be coming from the east, most likely. He's going to be coming from the east, walking west with the northwest wind, which will put him on the downwind side of that swamp, where he doesn't ever have to step foot in there until he smells what he's looking for. So that is what a lot of those paralleling trails are used for. And you'll see a lot of does use the paralleling trails outside of the rut for the buck that I'm after. The reason why he would use one of those trails is if he's slipping back in the morning and he's trying to J hook up into that swamp. He'll go downwind of where he wants to lay down on, probably most likely on the interior of the swamp trail because he's already walked through the hardwood, so he knows he's safe there. Now he gets into that interior and he works downwind of it before he J hooks into his bed that he wants to lay in. And some people listening may say, "Well, a swamp is water. Like, why would they lay in there?" That these swamps are water. I mean, some of the swamps I hunt, they could be 4 inches of water. Some swamps I hunt are waist deep of water, and it doesn't really matter to them how deep it is as long as their beds are dry. And inside of these swamps, there could be islands out there, like the size of a computer desk, or there could be a root ball out there, just enough high ground. You'd be surprised that what they will lay on to stay up out of that water. And as long as they can lay on it, they're safe. In the thing about the swamp too is I talked about the J hook part of it for his smell wise, so he could scent check that bed. Where a lot of times these swamps are so nasty, Matt, that honestly, they're not always wind based, in my opinion. I used to always think that, but we can get into why I don't think it's always wind based because they're so thick and nasty, and they're very noisy inside of there.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking when you're talking about the islands, and I think I know the answer here just based off what you just said, but are you ever pushing into those islands to hunt deeper into the swamp? Or are you, and I know it's situational,
Hmm.
but or is the main focus out on the edges of the swamp?
Yeah, so that all depends on what the type of swamp. I know of a spot I can kind of talk about that it's been a while since I've hunted it, but it's almost where a swamp and a cattail marsh almost meet. And the reason this works so well is because there's more than one island there. There's multiple islands in there, and you can kind of stage hunt your way back to the farthest island. But to me, a lot of times the island is only as good as the food that's going to be on there. A lot of times, because I'm not seeing them. they're not bedding like directly in the middle of this island. If there's an island, I kill one of my bucks. And the last time I hunted that, I killed one in 2019 off that island. The very first day of season, walked in there, and I knew that the acorns were dropping because I spot checked it already. And he was bedding. So I accessed it from the east, and then we had like a westerly wind, you know, a westerly wind. Yeah, westerly wind. So I kind of had the wind in my face the whole time. And I knew I was so close that, for an example, like I didn't even get up in a tree. I just hunted from the ground, and I could hear that deer coughing in his bed before he ever got up and came in there. But, that he was bedding like off the tip of it. And it wasn't even on the island. Like after, postseason, I went and looked at it because I love doing that. Like after you kill a deer, just kind of going back in there and seeing what maybe he was doing. Where there was a little root ball that he was laying on that was probably 30 yards off that island. You know what I mean? And I don't think like that hunt never happens without it being really windy because you're constantly walking through water and whatnot. Now I think that worked so well because I had a couple islands I could bounce to. I kind of started off with like the easiest, like closest one. He happened to be on that island. I think it was strictly because guess what island had some oaks on it? That one. The other three did not. So that was pivotal. Now, I've also hunted another swamp that has probably the best island I've ever seen on it. But that one happens to get a doe family group that beds there every year on it, and you can't get within like it's usually depends on the leaf cover and vegetation. The closest I've ever got to it was back in 2012. I killed a buck, killed him 9 yards that on November 7th. But that doe family group was on that island, but I used that to my advantage, and I knew I set up where that buck was going to be working downwind of that island. Because he like if I knew the does are there, he damn well knows that the does are there too. So it's very I know like it's the cop out answer, like you said, it's very situational, but I think you gotta kind of know what that island is doing. Is it holding some doe bedding? Is it holding some food? Some islands could be strictly for staging. Like I've seen that too, where a lot of times I've hung a lot of SD card cameras on these islands and let them soak over the years, and it's just like they'll kind of open your eyes. Where like some years they could be really good, some years they could be really really bad. But I've learned like that's very food situational. Now, what I really love, if you got yourself an island that you can hunt that's got some good food on it, you add that food with like a good scrape on it. If you want to kill one in like the first 2 weeks of October, that is extremely, extremely deadly.
Yeah, I asked the question because I think nowadays people are trying to judge like how aggressive they should be.
Hmm.
And I found myself going back and forth until I've been able to dial it in for my own personal style. But where I've gone in trying to get aggressive, trying to get in and then blow out the whole swamp.
Yeah.
And because I keep pushing in, maybe even trying to get to an island that I see on a map. And I get in there and it's like I never see anything because they're maneuvering in a way that I can't even hear
Yeah.
them, or I'm hearing the splashes as they run off.
Yep.
And then the other, I guess the flip side of that is being so far back off
Hmm.
of it because you're afraid to get close to that bedding and get afraid to pushing them out. So, but I think a lot of conversation lately, and it might even be a confusion between a cattail swamp and more of a wooded swamp, is that kind of that beast style of hunting,
Hmm.
getting into the cattails and pushing out back to the islands. It's the reason why I want to talk about it because it's not a prescriptive method that you can just use on every type of swamp that you walk up on. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you explaining that and kind of talking through that.
Yeah. Okay. Because you nailed it, right? Like, when I think about, my time on swamp edges or just in that interior to the islands, I spend more of my time on those interior edges of the swamp. That's where majority of my time is. But if the island's telling me it's time to go, then I go. And there is a big difference between wooded swamps in cattail marshes. When it comes to cattail marshes, that's what you're hunting. You're hunting those islands, at least for me. And I'm not saying they're more predictable, but there's only so many places for them to go in those cattail marshes. So that's why that's why like your hunt could be determined on how many islands you have to hunt. Like if that cattail marsh only has one good island for you to hunt, you better go find some more cattail marshes to hunt, not just that one. Where like a lot of these wooded swamps that I hunt in Michigan, I mean there is a rhyme or reason to what they're doing in there, but boy, they're almost, these swamps are so kind of big and nasty at times. It's like you almost can't push them out of there. But you brought something up that I kind of wanted to also talk about today with swamp hunting. Is you brought up you about the sound of deer running through the swamp. And that is one of the very tough things about hunting some of these swamps, especially here in Michigan when we have such high deer density numbers. Let's say you bump a small buck or maybe a doe family group that's on the exterior of the swamp, and you bump them in there, and you bump those deer, and they all do it. They all automatically run right to that swamp. Well, that buck that you're after, when he's laying in there in that belly on his belly, and he hears all that splashing, he knows something's wrong. And you just automatically, most of the time, kept that deer on his belly for the rest of the evening. So that's the hard part of how far can you push? Like you really have to know extremely where those doe families are, because one doe family runs in there, he's going to stay on his belly or he's going to slip out the other side, and you'll never even know whether he was in there or not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I guess then what is I don't want to go too far into, 'cause we're going to get into different times throughout the year, because
Mhm.
what's interesting about you, I think a swamp, when I go out of state and I'm traveling, if I can find a swamp with that edge that you're talking about, I love setting up downwind during the rut. All I need is to see enough doe action, like
Mhm.
when I'm going in to scout in to go, okay, cool, there's does here, they're bedded in there. I can sit on the edge and I can almost count on a buck, cruising
Yep.
downwind. But you're getting it done early season on these swamps, which I think is like next level. I mean, it's almost, I don't want to say that it's easy. It's easier when you go to a state where the odds are stacked in your favor, and that's why I travel.
Mhm. Yep.
If I go to Illinois and or even Wisconsin, I've been there hunting the swamps there. Indiana, I've had really good luck on the downwind side of swamps during the rut. That the odds are stacked in my favor. In Michigan, it's a little bit different, but even, I mean, early season in Michigan, you're getting it done. What kind of sign are you looking for? So you talked about these junctions, but for a guy coming into the swamp the first time, he may be used to looking for rubs and scrapes. Does the sign does it replicate what he might see in the hardwoods, or does it look different in the swamps?
Yeah, so it definitely can look different in the swamps. I'll have to show you some pictures afterwards, Matt. That I've shared some of these pictures with people that usually just kind of blow their minds when they see it. But when it comes to rubs, the one thing I always got to watch about the rubs is, you know, when I find those really big rubs in a swamp, whether it's right in I love to find them right in the interior of that swamp, because then I know for sure it's not just, he wasn't just paralleling the exterior trail. Now it tells me he's in the interior. And usually if I can find one in the interior, it's going to give you a pretty good good idea of his entry and exit. And if a lot of times with these swamps, like there comes a point where it's like, listen, give me no water in them or give me lots of water. Because when there's lots of water, like you can follow them. Like if you ever watch like muskrat trails through like, nasty like bottoms of the lake, like there'll be all this kind of weeds and whatnot. And then there'll be just nothing. And that's a lot of what I see in these swamps is those big, they're big trails, honestly, that run through these swamps because they've been doing it for, years and years and years. I mean, that's forever, and there won't be any vegetation growing on them. So when I can see, like, say, a big rub right alongside one of those interior trails like that, that's a dead giveaway to me. Like especially like just the one-on-one of rubs. Like say, say if we came in on that south side of that rectangle swamp that we talked about, we're walking south to north. And we walk in there, we see a big tree, but then we kind of turn around, we look backwards. We are headed north and we look back south, and all of a sudden we say, man, look at that rub that's on the north side of that tree that we just walked by, but we didn't notice it till we turned around and looked. That's automatically telling me like, okay, that's his exit for sure. He's using that for his exit at least. And but I'll see those rubs like that. Now you might find some around their beds, but it's so dependent on what kind of tree species they even have to rub in there. But when they're on that interior, right on that interior edge right there, Matt, is what it is to me is if anyone's ever watched an older class buck exit a swamp, if you can visually see him, like pieces of him before he fully exits that hard edge, what happens is a lot of 99% of the time I hear him sloshing through the water before I can see him, but I'm visually watching for where he's coming from. When he hits that interior edge, naturally, if I'm going to find some rubs in the swamp, this is where it's going to be. He stands there for a few minutes, and his ears are going back and forth. He's licking his nose. He's basically at that time of the evening, so it's an evening hunt. Every other deer is already exited, so he's listened for their reaction when they left. None of them blew, none of them ran, and he's sitting right there and just taking all his senses in. And it's like this buffer. And that's where, if he wants to lay down a big rub, that's where I see it. It's right on that buffer of the interior of the swamp. So if you're looking for rubs, that's what I'd be looking for. Is I'd be looking in the interior, but don't just look from one edge of it. Like, you got to wrap your head around these trees, because I can't tell you how many times over the years I've tried to train myself to stop and look backwards sometimes, because it's like there's so much stuff that I've walked by and I would have missed if I didn't stop and slow down and just look behind me and going, oh, okay, he's going, okay, this isn't his entry into the bedding, this is his exit. Now I just gotta find his entry. So that's one thing I've tried to do. And then when it comes to guys finding scrapes, and I'm a giant scrape guy. Now the thing about a swamp is, like I said, the water levels are constantly changing. I've seen them waist high. This is one scrape I know about. I've seen them be waist high, okay, with water. I've seen it as dry as a bone before. And no matter the water level, the licking branches will still get used. And I can show you pictures of deer that maybe the water's 4 inches deep, and he's sitting there just raking the water out of the scrape with his hoofs. I've seen it where the water's up to his belly and he's still full neck, fully extended, still working the licking branches. So, are they as easy to see when the water levels are up? Absolutely not. You got to slow down and you got to be looking for the licking branches. If you get into an area of a swamp and you're kind of working some trail systems, and you get where maybe some multiple trails are coming together, and maybe maybe there's some blowdowns or some nasty brush in the swamps that kind of forcing them through an area. If you stand there and go, man, this would be a great spot. Like, if there wasn't water here, this would be a great spot for a scrape. Maybe stop right then and really look at what branches are hanging down over the trails, because it just one nip off a branch or one twist, and it may just clue it away. Now, another really good example is maybe you're coming off a dry year. Maybe it was dry. Let's say it was dry in your swamp in 2023. Now it's 2024, and now you have water in there. Well, the thing about it, that dry year, so maybe they did lay down a lot of good groundwork on that scrape, where you let that water settle down from walking through it and kind of look down in there, and a scrape will kind of look like a bluegill bed will in a lake, where you can kind of see it's cleaned out, it's not flush with the ground around it. But that takes like that I mean, you can't be like, for days like that, don't go out there and think that you're going to go walk 10 miles. Like, you got to take your time to find those little little details like that in the swamp. And outside of those two things right there, you're talking about like if you're going to find the rubs or the scrapes in the swamp, and maybe even looking for their beds in there, because their beds will actually stand out more than the other two will in a swamp. Like their beds year round, their beds are going to stand out really well in there. But the one thing about a swamp is on those edges. Let's backtrack out to the exterior edge where maybe we're getting to dry ground. They can't hide a track, and they cannot clean all the mud off them hoofs when they exit those swamps. So a lot of times, if you're really paying attention, when they exit those swamps, sometimes the water levels a lot, they'll almost shake like a dog. And you look on the side of some of the swamp grass or the trees around there, or depending on what time of year, maybe you have a bunch of leaves on the ground where like that mud. Think of a dog, like a dog running through the water and or like, how about this? You just let the dog outside and it's been raining all the time and he comes flying in the house and all that splatter goes everywhere and now you're stuck wiping it up. That whitetail leaves that same kind of sign out in the woods. It's very minute, but if you pay attention, it's there. And those exit trails, they're always muddy because they're like it's right on that edge. And the tracks can be exaggerated a bit because it is muddy, but he can't hide his track when in those trails, and then those trails lead right to those junctions outside of there.
So the sign that you're talking about sounds like it's right on that edge of the swamp where it meets hard ground.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, as you back away, and the reason why I'm walking through this a little bit is I'm trying to paint a picture of the level of aggression a guy may need when he comes to hunt a swamp.
Yep.
So as you're walking up to the swamp, you're on hard ground. I would imagine you're finding scrapes back there as well off of that.
Mm-hmm.
How much attention do you pay to those scrapes away from the edge?
So those scrapes I'm paying more attention to earlier in the season, and depending on how far away from the swamp it is, how much I'm going to pay attention is I'm going to be watching what kind of water levels we have, because the higher the water levels, the further away maybe those scrapes have my attention. The lower the water levels, like if it's 200 yards away, then it's like, okay, it probably doesn't have my attention too much. I need to push a little closer. So it's almost like this concept, when it comes to like the swamp bedding stuff. I don't, like I said, they don't want to have to be in there. They don't want to have to live in the water. They're forced to live in the water by the pressure we put on them. So in the early season, that's when it's easiest for me to push too much. Okay.
Mm-hmm,
And I'll paint I'll give you guys an example. The buck I killed last year, I was going to go hunt an island. Okay. This is a great example. An island that had an awesome scrape on it. Okay. And well, right as I start to get towards that edge of just the swamp, not even the island's another like 150 into the swamp. As I just get towards the edge, the buck I'm after stands up and runs into the swamp. And I was like, I killed him on October 4th. And I know a lot of people they may say, well, that's only 4 days in the season, but I expected him to have more pressure put on him already. And he just simply didn't. And so that's why, to me, he wasn't pushed into that swamp just yet. Like a lot of the stuff that I'm really good at is like pressured style bedding. Like that is when it's very predictable for me. Like when it's not, when shit's not getting a lot of pressure yet, it's like it seems to be more randomized. So earlier in the season, I don't expect those bucks, especially after seeing that one last year. I don't expect them to be deep into that swamp as much. I actually think they're out there on that dry ground just enough, right on that edge, where he's looking up and down each edge of it, but he's mainly looking out towards whatever probably food source he wants to head to, whether it's oaks, beans, alfalfa, whatever the case may be. But so this buck last year, he stands up and he runs directly into the swamp and directly at that island I was headed to. And instantly I just get pissed off. I'm just like, oh, yeah, I mean, you guys know how it goes. It seems like, when you get a chance at a good buck, it happens one time a year. Then here in Michigan, it's like, man, that's probably it. But I sat there and I thought about it for a second, I was looking at where he was laying. I was like, honestly, Matt, if I was paying better attention, I was so destination focused where I wanted to go to. I think if I was paying attention better, I could have shot him out of his bed. He let me get that close to him, but I just didn't expect him to be right there. And after I bumped him up, I thought, you know what? He's laying there because nobody's been back here yet. And I damn well know exactly where he's headed. Like that's one part of like a lot of scouting. Like I knew where he's headed. And if he was headed back in there, I thought, you know what, I'm going to change it up. I'm not going to push deep in there. I'm not even going to push to the water's edge because I know once he runs, he's going to stop and he's going to listen because he knows he should expect to hear me come into that swamp. That's what he thinks. I said, well, I'm just going to hold back like 25 yards off that water's edge. And I know where he was laying right there because I know what food source he wants to go to tonight. I'm just going to, like, I think he might come right back here tonight. And sure shit, the only deer that come right back through there was him that night. And I shot him at like 9 yards. But it was like, it was totally different from what I was thinking of that hunt. Like, I was like, oh, I got to go to that island. I got to get deep in there. So my thought process has changed a lot on throughout the season how they're using those swamps to bed. But even though he wasn't bedding in that swamp, you can bet your ass that when he felt danger and he dipped back into the swamp and he exited, which he used the exact same trails to do both, it was what I'm going to call, when we haven't even covered this yet, it was like an inside corner of a swamp because the swamp made an L right there. Everyone talks about inside corners of like food sources and stuff. If I can find an inside corner of a swamp edge, oh my gosh, like, you know, you may not have a dip or a point coming out right there, but you have multiple edges coming together. That's phenomenal. And if anyone's having a hard time picturing it, let's get back to our rectangle swamp that we made. And let's take this rectangular swamp that we did and let's take it to the northeast corner. Okay. So along the top, that's north. So we're at the very northeast corner. Now let's put a cattail marsh that comes from the north to south and it meets it at that northeast corner. Now we have an inside corner right there, just like everyone that has, a bunch of private managed ground, what they dream about for having, a beautiful food source. We just now we're letting Mother Nature create one of these in the swamp, and it's like that's phenomenal too. But it's the same concept. That corner is a break in edges. It's got multiple edges coming together there. But yeah, so throughout the years, I've kind of learned if the area you're hunting, swamp country, if it hasn't had a ton of pressure yet, don't expect them to be deep inside that swamp just yet. They're not going to be back there yet. They'll get there from you hunting there. They'll eventually get pushed down in there, but they'll really be on the edges right there. Was what I truly believe.
Yeah, so if you're on private land, you can kind of manage that maybe. I mean, if you've got permission on private land, it could be just as busy as public. So you could start off early season kind of back from the edge and work your way slowly in. Do you agree with that? I mean, because
I would say so. I would say so. No one, you got to know where they want to head to after they exit the swamp, right? You got to kind of know what destination food source they want to go to. It may be pretty close, maybe pretty far, depends on what kind of, does that swamp country, is it butting right up to farm country? And if it is, do this. You can go out right now in the summertime and glass deer. And if you're close to swamp country, look at the bottom half of their legs. It is going to tell you whether they're bedding in water or they're not. Because if they're bedding in water, I'm not saying bedding in the water, they're bedding inside a swamp, having to walk through that water. Most of these swamps, they're dirty and they're going to be black. And that will give you a really good indication. If you're like, well, I can't glass my food source, go out there and walk that bean edge, because that same muddy water that's going to be stuck to the bottom half of their leg will be wiped all over the very first couple of rows of beans as they walk into them. That will tell you if they're inside of that inside of the swamp edge. So yeah, so knowing where they want to go to eat that night, and it's kind of like you got to kind of learn you have to bump some of these deer sometimes. That's how you're going to learn. Like like I said in the beginning, a lot of what I've talked about is from a lot of failures along the way, kind of knowing how close I can get or how far off I need to lay off. And a lot of times like that means constantly staying on top of what the water level is. Because if that water level's down, they're going to be down in there farther. That water level's up, they're going to be pushed maybe out to that food source a little closer. But knowing what that food source is, this is what I love. This is honestly, this is my early season game right here. Knowing the swamp, where that bedding edge is going to be, knowing where the food source is, and I a lot of times in that very first scrape outside of their bedding area along that junction, that is my like I love that for early season. I when they exit that bedding area, I want the first thing they want to stop at. I'm looking for that scrape. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah. So moving on from early season, well, is there anything else about early season we should say before we move on?
No, I don't. Nothing that I can think about. The only other thing I'd maybe hit on about early season is say if you've been scouting a swamp area and you're going into season, and let's say you're looking at the edge of a swamp, and maybe there's right outside the edge of the swamp becomes a high spot and there's some oaks on it. Let's say there's some oaks on it. And you're like, man, there was a big deer here before, and the rubs look 2 to 3 years old. But say it's very apparent that there wasn't any rubs there last year. My advice would be is do not write that off at all. If anything, get excited. And this is why. I used to be the guy that write it off. I would say, you know what? Either he's dead or there's not a big one in the area anymore. But the more I've watched it, you remember what I said that maybe there's some oaks up there that just very possibly the oaks didn't produce last year, but they did 2 or 3 years ago. And if you know anything about oaks, if all of a sudden you're looking at those rubs and you're like, dude, those are 2 or 3 years old, but there wasn't anything last year. I would definitely be checking on that for early season this upcoming year. So don't like old historical rubs get me excited. And if they're 2 or 3 years old with oak trees around, they even get me more excited for the upcoming year. It may not be this upcoming year, it may not be 2024, but in 2025, then all of a sudden, like if you go another year of those oaks don't produce, oh, it's that could be dynamite. I mean, because you got to think it. You give that buck, he's right on the edge of that swamp, and he's all of a sudden he has to come out 78 yards to the first acorns dropping. Then there's another bean field 300 yards away. The bean field is he's not gonna get seen hardhorn before dark. But that oak tree, guess what else is probably around that oak tree? Probably damn good scrape right there too. So that would be something else for early season. That's something that I've learned the hard way. Rope places off because I thought like, man, he must have been killed, or there wasn't one around here last year, where it's like, it's not always the case. A lot of times it's just strictly food dependent why the sign looks like that.
Other thing you said before we move on too is that you talked about that water's edge, kind of if it recedes back, then they're going to be further back in. It's like that water creates another edge. That's just another edge that's created. And as it moves back, because the edge of a swamp and the edge of hardwoods has its own distinctive look, and as that water recedes, it'll still look that way. You still be able to, you may think that's the beginning, but what you're saying, if that water's receding back, no, it's actually there's another edge on that water that you need to go back and find.
Yeah,
and understand.
Yeah, and a lot of times too, you can naturally see whereabouts a water line should be because of what kind of vegetation is growing, what kind of brush right there. Like usually it's visually you can see it. Like when it's leaf off in the postseason, it's pretty open, but you can see it because of like the brush line. Like it's hard. And that's what like another thing about green up. A lot of guys scared, they don't want to mess with the green up. But it's like, man, when that vegetation does grow in the swamp, it's like a hard, man. It looks like a brick wall right there because of that hard edge, you know. But yeah, that swamp level is just constantly changing. But like you said, that water is another edge. Like that's why, like to me, even though this is a swamp, it doesn't matter where I go in the country. Like I'm always attracted to where multiple things come together. And that's, whether it's a break in the swamp, whether it's a inside corner of a swamp, whether you got an island or maybe you got two swamps and then it's some dry ground. And it's always just, whether you're in Kansas or Missouri, like you watch where multiple things come together, whether it's terrain features or whether it's tree rows, whether it's crop ground, or like they're just edge animals naturally.
Yeah, which is so good to hear too, because you can actually apply maybe your area to the swamp. You just have to like
Hmm.
change the terminology around.
Yep.
I mean, if you're used to hunting, Nebraska, Kansas, CRP fields, I mean, it's going to operate very similar with the edge and where they're bedding and all of that. And CRP, they may go a little bit more in the middle, but
Yeah.
you can use as you're talking, like I'm running some ridge scenarios through my mind where there's like huge greenbrier
Yep.
sections where they're bedding and stuff like that, and it kind of lines up for me as well.
Yeah, because
So
it like that greenbrier makes it edge up,
yeah,
like it's on top of a ridge, like, and you have a section of it, like there's edges all the way around that greenbrier, and if you just watch like naturally, like hell, even watch a whitetail in a bean field, naturally they come out in a certain area for a certain reason, they don't like the monotonous stuff of things. They like when it's broken up, something to their advantage.
yeah, yeah. What is before we move on away from early season? What is early season in your mind? Like, if we'll use Michigan as an October 1 start, how long is early season to you before you
I
get
think.
into like pre-rut or something?
Yeah, so I won't even say pre-rut, but to me, early season is 7 days because after 7 days, then we're talking about a pressured whitetail, honestly. But as soon as like let's say October 1 through 7th, like I kind of break my seasons up into weeks. I look at windows. I look at a lot of my whitetail hunting as windows. But so I'm going to count early season as the very first week because after they start applying that pressure, I don't see a lot of like historical information about spots or deer the very first like 7 days of the season. But all of a sudden, when October 10th rolls around, that's when I start seeing like a lot of like historical spots heat up that I've learned about or particular bucks. So, like to me, first week of season, that is early season because after 7 days, then like you got to shift with it. Because think of this map. If you go into the woods October 1st, then you go into the woods October 8th, dude, it looks totally different.
Mhm.
October 8th to the 14th looks totally different. Like every day in October, those woods are changing so much. Leaves are turning colors, they're dropping, some vegetation's drying out. Like it, and they're getting, human pressure applied to them. Like there's a lot of change going on right there. But early season for me, first week, man, that's it. That's it.
Yeah. So the next date range that, we could give an overview of would be to you the 8th through the when's that in?
Yeah, so the next date range would be for me is probably like the 8th through the 19th, and it's arguably growing to be one of my favorite times to hunt. Actually, now more particular the 14th through the 19th, because now pretty much like whether I'm hunting private or public, I don't have anything I can have sole permission of. So even if I'm hunting private, they've all had the pressure applied. All the neighboring properties, whether it's public or private, they've all put the pressure, have applied the pressure. So now the good bedding areas that I've scouted, that where the sign is, because I've actually thought about this. It's like we do all this scouting in the postseason. We're looking at all that sign, and outside of like them losing their velvet, most of all that signs already being laid down once pressure's being applied. So that's the kind of stuff I'm looking for. I'm looking for pressured bedding, right? And I think naturally there's two things that are happening right then. Pressure is being applied, huge factor. And the second factor, the 14th to the 19th, this is, even circling back to knowing the doe groups that are on islands in some of these swamps, is I think that October 14th through 19th is the kind of the time period that the first most mature doe in some of these square miles is starting to smell good, and she's starting to kind of feel herself a little bit. And that right then, those two factors right there is why I think I start seeing some of this historical information kick in, whether it be a spot or a specific buck itself. So that is kind of my next time frame. So you had opening week, and then I'm kind of really buying. I don't want to say buying time because I'm not wasting hunts, but if I can get to like the 14th or 19th, if you're chasing a particular buck, if you're looking for like honestly the biggest, oldest buck in a square mile, and that square mile's got a really nice swamp in it, and you know that he's probably been pushed into there. If you can know the doe herd in there, the doe family groups, if you can figure out what doe pops early, like most of the time, I believe there's one in there somewhere like that. If you can figure out where she's at, you can kill that buck during that time frame over a scrape. Because I know this is a probably super hot take. I've talked about it before, but I actually think some of the oldest does in Michigan that they select what buck they would actually like to be bred by. I've got some pretty wild trail camera videos during that time frame that's kind of made me a believer, like seeing is believing for that time frame for me. But that's my next time frame that I'm more excited about that than I am early October, honestly, because I know where the buck that I'm hunting, I know where he should be during that time frame.
So you were talking about on scrapes, you can hunt them on scrapes. So an individual who let's just say this is their first season hunting a swamp, and they may not have the historical data that you have. Would you say it could be a good technique for them to at least concentrate on like a really good scrape that they've found, on a edge of a swamp there that might be during that time period a good way for them to get a shot at a decent buck or a good buck?
Absolutely. That's
Yeah.
what I'm doing. It's 100% what I'm doing. It's usually the biggest scrape because it's got the most pulling power to it. It's usually the biggest scrape that's the first stop for that buck leaving that swamp. I've told this story before, but what really opened my eyes to it was on October 14th, and now this doe has done it for years. She walks by. Okay, let's say let's go back to our rectangle swamp. Okay, she's to the west of our rectangle swamp, and she's walking to the east and walks through a scrape that I happen to have just a crappy camera on, but it was on video mode. Why I didn't put it on video mode, I have no clue, but I'm so happy I freaking did. She walks by this camera, walking west to east, and walks in the west end of this swamp. Okay, boom, she walks in there. Next video, here she comes out. She's big as a horse. It's super, and she stops in that scrape, Matt, and she looks behind her, and you just know. And I'm just praying, like, please let this video run long enough because something's coming. And here comes the biggest deer I knew about in that square mile, like probably like a truly a 4.5-year-old buck here in Michigan. And this is like 2.5 hours before daylight, and I'm just like, oh, and you gotta remember, I didn't know about this till after the season. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I got to run another video mode on this next year. Well, that doe has done that for 3 years straight. And now it's a time window. It's October 14th through 19th. And I'm not saying every scrape is like that. They're few and far in between, but if you can find that one, man, you got like that buck didn't care what that wind was doing that day because what it looked like to me is, she walked through that scrape, walked into that bedding area, found what she wanted, walked back out, walked right through the scrape, stopped, looked behind her, and here he came right after her. And it's October 14th at this is before time change. It's at like 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when she's doing this. And it's like, and that happened years ago, and it started really opening my eyes. And now it's like, oh my gosh, like if you can have the right bedding area and know, these swamps, it's like you just got to kind of know what is the swamp that, think about this is like if it was gun season and all the deer are going to get pushed into like the best area, what swamp is that going to be?
Mhm.
Because that's what I think happens well before gun season starts. So when they feel that first initial pressure of hunting season, they don't know whether, like obviously they don't hear gunshots, but they know human pressure's ramped up and they're going to get into there. Then they're going to start adjusting themselves from there. But like that time period, seeing that doe like that, now I cover a lot of ground and I found three scrapes that can produce like that in that time window. And what was once before a time period of reading when I was a kid that you don't even hunt, you can't do any of this stuff where it's like, yeah, they may slow down some of their movement, but if you can kind of stay on top of them and really know your doe family groups like that, like those scrapes like that without knowing what the doe family groups are doing in and around that swamp is, I mean, I wouldn't know that kind of information without them.
Yeah. I found a similar scrape in hill country and here in Michigan, and just complete luck. It was just it was a fantastic scrape. It look when you see it, you kind of know it's multiple licking branches. It's deep in the ground. It's been there for years. And threw a camera up on it, and I saw really good action on probably the best buck in the area. I had ran enough cameras in the area to know kind of who was who.
Yeah.
And I only had him at night, and then all of a sudden during that 3 day window, probably from like the 16th to the 18th, he's in there on that scrape, and I couldn't quite figure out what was going on. I've heard you talk about this theory before, and I
Hmm.
started thinking to myself, I'm like,
Yep.
I
Yeah.
wonder if he's checking on some does that in that area that are starting to heat up a little bit. I think
Yeah. I mean,
ran the camera again the next year and same thing. I mean, he
yeah.
right around that same window time period, he
Yep.
was there. So yeah.
I mean, in for instance, too, like if any listener, if you think about if you've ever seen a fawn, say that very first week of May, okay, because I've done this because I came across a fawn one time on May 4th, right? And I've done the math back. That's October 15th, give or take a day. And that's if that fawn was born that day. So if that first week of May, any fawn dropping is in the very heart of October. The very heart. And now I do believe it's the most mature doe though that happens like that. Now, in like your instance, like, if we had never talked about this and we ran into each other at a bar and you're telling me a story, I'd be like, dude, there's a doe in there. There's a doe in there that's got that buck doing that. But let's say, if you were a guy though, like, and you can't find the scrape and you're trying to hunt that period of October, I honestly would be looking for one of those muddy junctions just outside of that bedding area. And you're going to have to push close because now like I said, they felt that pressure. They feel the human pressure and they're going to be standing on that buffer zone like we talked about earlier. And that sun's already going to be down. He's not going to move far. But if you don't have a scrape to hunt over, I'd find myself a break in the swamp, maybe an inside corner of the swamp. That's what I'd be looking for. Just simply trying to put yourself whatever food source you believe that they're eating at that time in between that food source and that swamp bedding on some of the muddiest junctions that you can find on a break of the edge.
So moving into kind of that later October time period, does your technique change at all? Because it sounds like a very similar. It almost sounds like
Of
scrape
course,
week.
man.
Yeah,
Stays
yeah,
the course. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah. It's, I get, it is that late October going into Halloween. It's such a great time for scrape week. I do believe, unpopular opinion, scrape week should be moved up all the way to October 14th. I believe it should be a 2 week window. That's just me. No, the late October scrape week. Yes, I think that right there, a ton of activity, but I do believe that the biggest deer in your area, he starts using them, like I said, the 14th through 19th. But no, man, all the way, you take the 14th of October all the way up to say Halloweenish time. The tactics kind of stay the same, and I'm never. The one thing I will say is about this style of hunting is, we talked about a swamp today. Now, I've worked a long time at building a whole Rolodex of swamps like that. So I'm constantly bouncing around a lot of places. So I don't keep pounding just one swamp like that. I'm doing this at a lot of places. So like every time I go in, it's kind of like a fresh, brand new sit at a brand new property, public or private. On the south side, north side, it doesn't new scrape, like that's kind of the name of my game. So as much as it sounds like that, yes, I am doing the same thing from, the middle of October to the very end of October. It's constantly on fresh, new, good stuff.
Yeah, and I think we started off the conversation by saying, "Hey, there's a guy that's traveling. He's only got a week." But honestly, most likely, if he's not traveling during that time period, and we're all going to
Sure.
save it up for
Yep.
either the last part of October, first part of November, or even into that second week of November. So if you're using those, it's probably someone who's just moving into a swamp for the first time. They've got it
Yeah.
either a new piece or they found public by their house. I'm thinking of so many areas of actual like swamp that I have overlooked just on some public near my house for
Hmm.
whatever reason. I don't hunt a ton by my house. I'm traveling more, but just having these conversations and thinking about deer that have disappeared from camera, and even they've disappeared a mile and a half, 2 miles from the swamp. I'm now thinking, okay, that's where I need to actually put up some more cameras, which is I should have thought about it, but I just didn't until now what we're
Yeah.
talking. But something to be said about walking up now that we're saying that hey, they're bedded. And are you saying a lot of times they're bedded just on the inside of that swamp?
Yeah,
Looking,
for like the end of October time frame.
yeah,
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 it's very much dependent on and I know I've referred to it a couple times, but that water level is going to kind
yeah,
of push them to or from, but they're once they are inside the swamp, Matt, is those the biggest oldest buck, they do have like destination
yeah,
beds in there. And it's not, they don't lay in the same one every night, but they're like, if you're ever out scouting in some of these swamps, like you ever come across and you're like, dude, this looks like the king's bed in here. That's probably his bed. He's probably got two or three other ones like that. So I'll see a lot of like some of the younger bucks on that interior edge, but usually like the big buck that I'm after, he'll be in there a little bit more
yeah.
because he's going to utilize those younger deer to exit, and then he's going to utilize that buffer on that very edge before he exits. So he could be in there. I mean, he could be in there a poke, but even though it feels like he's in there quite a ways, remember like there's always edge around. So what may feel like a long walk where he's from where you're hunting to where he's at, like he can escape a back door that maybe only be 55 yards off the other edge. So it's very, very dependent. But yeah, that pretty much once I get to that second week of October all the way to Halloween, I'm kind of hunting that same kind of scenario.
So you have eyes on you as you're walking in. I mean, you got to think that as you're entering into your stand location. And so I mean, it goes without saying that you have to be as stealthy as possible. Wind definitely has to be in your favor. You can't risk it at this point of time in the season that we were just talking about. And you've got to really maneuver quietly and use as much cover as you can to your advantage to get into your tree. And then I would imagine you're using the right height of the tree based on cover. You're not going to all of a sudden
Mhm.
skyline yourself over top where everybody can see you that's
Yeah.
bedded on that edge. So now that we're getting into that more like rut time period, does anything change there? I mean, you're on the edge still.
Yeah. Before we get into that, you brought up about the stealthiness.
Mhm.
I'd love to talk about this
Yeah,
real quick. Make sure we cover this because I think this is such an overlooked part is, as we get deeper into like say Halloween and kind of going into that first week of November, which honestly, like not to get too sidetracked, like October or November 1st through 5th is a time period that I've struggled with quite a bit right there. Like I don't know what it is. Like I'd rather take off the last week of October, go to work the first week of November, than take the second week of November off.
I
It's
agree.
just a time period I struggle with. But as we go, as we're like probably honestly, once we get towards like that 25th, 26th, 27th of October going into November, then I find myself usually like that means, we're at the tail end of October. We've probably had some rain. The water levels are coming up. That I find myself like now we're actually hunting in the water quite a bit. Like 9 out of 10 times we're in the water. But I this is what I want to hit on about being stealthy. When you're hunting swamp country like this is one thing that I would highly suggest to people. Once you've entered the water, don't ever, if you can, don't ever actually take your feet up out of the water if you do not have to. Kind of like imagine being at the beach and it's like knee deep or like say ankle deep water. Every time you pick your boot up and you get heavy hunting boots, every time you pick it up, it breaks the water and that water sits there and drops off your boot. And then every time you put your boot back down, it breaks it again and it has a noise to it. If you can just keep your feet in the water and it's kind of shuffle them as you go through the swamp, it's way more quieter and there's no cadence to that. Like when an animal like walks, like when I talked about hearing a whitetail come through the water, like they have such a cadence. Like I can almost tell you how many deer are coming through the water because of the cadence of it. Well, that's what those deer are constantly listening for something to come through that water. That's why, like a lot of times, if you ever see a coyote in the swamp, they don't love the water, but a lot of times they work across the logs because it's dead silent for them to get in there. So that was you talk about being stealthy. That is something that I want to hit on is try to, if you can, keep both of your boots underwater and just kind of shift your feet. And it's not like it. The way I say it may sound like it's difficult, but it's not. It's pretty easy to do in the swamp. But so I'm kind of getting, I'm usually pushing deeper into the swamps. But as we roll into November, and now maybe I'm not hunting technically right over the scrapes because I think that's why part of why that say November 1st through 5th I struggle a little bit is because I do see a lot of my scrapes right outside the swamp slow down a little bit. A lot of times like I said, this has been done from a lot of scouting, but if I can find like two swamps that are pretty close to each other that has some high ground in between them, oh man, I love hunting areas like that as I get towards Halloween all the way into like that first and second week in November. That's a killer, because a lot of times it's the shortest travel. Say if a buck is working from one bedding area to the other on the downwind side, just knowing like if the wind's blowing out of the north, we want to be on the south side of the where those two swamps kind of connect each other. That's really dynamite. And then, another tactic during that time of year is we kind of circle back to knowing if there's some does bedding on some certain islands. If you know there's some does bedding on islands, like getting downwind of those islands, because he is going to come check those islands sometime during the day. Hopefully it's during daylight, but he is going to come check some of those. And then I here's another tactic, and I'll try to paint the best picture as possible. Let's say we'll take that same rectangular swamp, but let's say our hardwoods is starting to get a little bit flooded on each end of it. But then you kind of have what looks like a finger that kind of leads up into the south side of that swamp. Okay. And if you can get like a good northwest, northeast side or wind, man, I find a lot of bucks will, if they want to go up into the bedding area, into that swamp, because that swamp's going to hold more than just bucks and does. These are big swamps, like it's got all kinds of bedding in it. That they'll travel up that finger, and like if you got a northwest wind, just put yourself on the east side of that finger. If you got a northeast wind, put yourself on the west side of that finger, where he's kind of basically like that's mainly for a morning hunt. Like he's been out on his feet all night long and he wants to come up in that bedding area and he wants to see who laid down. Like this is going to be at 9, 10 o'clock in the morning. He finally comes, like you're going to hear him coming from a mile away through the dry leaves. And it's like I said, we got this rectangular swamp and it's kind of been, the water's been pushing out, but he's got a little bit of it's like a dry strip of land that's kind of leading right up in there. They love to travel right up through that and just kind of position yourself. It's going to feel like the wind's going to blow right at them, but you're going to be just kind of off on that edge.
Is that a little bit of the thinking there, that it's more about ease of travel than it is cover? Or I don't know, am I off a little bit?
Well, my thought process on, let's say if I backed off the swamp, okay, and this would be the reason why is, let's say we talked about having this rectangular swamp. Now let's have two of those now.
Yeah.
But let's make them 150 yards apart from each other, but they're exactly like kind of they're east and west of each other, but they're 150 yards apart from each other. That and the reason I talked about that is this is how I killed my biggest deer I've ever killed here in Michigan, where this deer he was getting the best of me. You know, when I zigged, he zagged. When I zagged, he zigged. It seemed like it. And it was back and forth, and it finally got to the point, Matt, that I knew he was working two swamps, and it always seemed to be like if I was on one swamp, he was on the other one, and if I went to the other one, he'd end up in this other one, and it finally got to the point that November 5th rolled around. And for us guys in Michigan, you know that you basically have 10 days before for gun season. And I've been applying plenty of pressure along with there's about 11 other guys that were applying pressure too. And everyone kind of knew about the deer in the area. And I finally got to the point, I says, I know he'll come between these two swamps sooner or later. It's just whether or not he's going to do it in daylight. That's going to be what I'm going to battle. And so I set up November 5th, and I had two different ways I could access it. And so basically, like with having two different ways of accessing it, and as long as we didn't have like a straight east or straight west wind, anything out of the north, anything out of the south, I just would bounce from one side to the other with access both ways. Well, and one way was terrible to access, like just with how hard it was compared to the other way. But hey, either way, I had a lot to play with here. And this was hard. Like, you get my mindset right, being so mobile. It's like, this was the type of deer that I was like, I'm going to sit here for 10 days. And because I was so convinced. My scouting told me that, like, just knowing this area, just knowing, like, eventually he's going to come through here. Luckily on day one he had came right through there, and it was like, that was on November 5th, and that's after time change, and it was like an hour and a half before daylight, just all by himself, come right through. He's going to work one bed into the other. He was directly on the downwind side, and it just opened my eyes up where it's like, I wonder how many other times that I've chased bucks that it's like sometimes you just gotta simply like get in between the two best bedding areas that now they're pretty close. If those were a mile apart, that's a whole different world. But we're talking 150, 175 yards apart between the two swamps. Just happens to be some high ground. You would think there'd be like a really good scrape there. For some reason, there just isn't. But if watching the deer travel back and forth, especially the bucks during the rut, that spot right there, like you have to know though, like that's only good during the rut. That's only a really good rut spot. Like you go sit there all you want early season, you may see some small bucks and some does, but you're not going to kill the big one. But that was good. That's kind of honestly my philosophy, why I put myself in between the two. I was ready to ride out a 10-day hunt in there, man. I was like, I had hung my stand. I was like, I'm going to sit here for 10 days, and I'll just bounce back and forth depending on what way the wind direction was. But that's just a very situational scenario though, that work like that.
How are you seeing bucks travel in, just say the one rectangle? Let's say you don't have another swamp during that time period. Are you still right on that edge, then catching them? Just running that edge downwind, seeing if there's any does bedded in there.
Yep.
You're right on the edge still.
Yep. Yeah, you're going to see them right on that edge. Now, the question is are they going to be on the interior or the exterior of the edge? Okay. If it's the middle of the day, I see them more in the interior, kind of working them. Now, you get that last, like, a lot of times it's like for a morning hunt, they've been out all night long, and they'll work that exterior, kind of looking for a place to cut in, and because there's going to be some does in there. Like, they're not usually working those until I think they kind of have a time sense of when those does have filtered back in there, right? And in the evenings, like say if it's after time change, so it's like say it's dark at 6. Like I'm not seeing them on that exterior cruising trail till maybe like 4:30 p.m. or later. Otherwise, it kind of keeps them inside. And the best case scenario is I kind of love, once the Halloween time hits, I love to be kind of in the interior of it. but we also means that leaves have dropped. So now I can at least visually see both. Because here's one thing I've watched about these cruising trails. Let's say let's say you're just off and you've seen one cruise it and it's November 7th. I would be right back. I would adjust for November 8th because boy, if most likely he'll probably, if he didn't find anything that night, he'll probably work that same one because like I said, these swamps hold a lot of deer. This isn't individual like buck bedding. There's multiple bucks bedding there, a lot of does bedding there. So if that buck that you're after, if you're just off, make your adjustment, maybe even make it that night, slip in there the next morning and just hang on tight because he's probably going to come back through. If not him, like there's a lot of bucks that use these trails like that. But the best case scenarios of maybe being in that interior and being able to see both and even possibly being able to shoot both. But I'd rather be in the interior after Halloween if I can be.
Okay, good. Thanks for the clarification. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot here. Now we go into late. Is there anything for rut during that rut period that you want to hit on that we didn't talk about?
No, not much. Don't be surprised if you see a buck bird, kind of bird dog a doe up into an island, and don't get too discouraged because if a buck can get a doe up on one of those islands, they'll probably be there 48, 72 hours. Just all you can do is hope and pray that when they're done that he kind of heads your way, but that can be discouraging. I hunted a buck one year that I watched him take a doe up onto this island, hunted that spot for 3 days, sat and watched the buck and the doe for 3 days straight. And then finally, when he was done, he just went off the complete opposite way. And I was like, dude, like, I was so convinced. I was like, if I just put my time in, he's coming my way. But like, they love to take those does on those little islands and just get them pinned down because I think they can really fight off the other bucks really, really well. One, they can they can hear a lot of the other bucks coming through the water, and it kind of like they put that doe up on that pedestal on that island and kind of force all the other bucks off of it. But that's kind of pretty much it for the rut, and the one thing that could change all of this, and I'm sure this will probably lead right into the late season part. The one thing that can change all of this stuff, if it gets cold early, and if you get some ice on top of that water, the one I have found is either they want open water or they want ice where they can stand on it. If they are punching through with their legs every time, they don't like it. And unless you force them in it, like say they're on dry ground and you bump them, they'll run through it. They don't, but they won't stay in it. They do not like that. And I get it. Like I watch my dog when we're out postseason scouting. If he's breaking through the ice, watch him how he picks his legs up and stuff. He doesn't like that. And I don't think those deer like that either. So if it gets cold on you, if it's November 10th and all of a sudden that swamp starts freezing over, that could completely change what they're doing. Like you better be shifting with them.
Man, that was great. Yeah, really good. Because that is something that likely can happen.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it's been so many years now where it's actually been like 60 or 70 during that time period. Yeah. You're like, what's going on?
Yeah, that's one right there where it's like it's unreal because when you see it happen, what was once could be some of the best bedding that about can be a ghost town overnight. Mm-hmm. They either want it rock solid where they can walk on it, or they want open water, or unless you force them in it, and then they'll obviously that's their fail safe is to always dump off into these swamps.
Yep. Yeah. The next part, late season, is going to be a little difficult just because it really is based on, I imagine, food, where it's mm-hmm. at. I mean, of course, the swamp is that bedding, and it does provide, I would assume most swamps provide, enough food just based off of what's in there, browse. But I would also imagine it has to depend on what fields are still up during that time, if they are still up. I mean, if every field's down, I would imagine a swamp would be still active, really nice. If all of a sudden you've got a cornfield that's still up down the road and everything else has been cut down, do you ever see that change where they shift over to the food, or are they still kind of saying, you know what, there's enough browse here that I can live here, browse here, and at night I can travel? I don't know.
Yeah.
What's been your experience?
Yeah. So what I see is still the best swamps will always still hold the best bedding areas, like which are going to still hold the best deer. I haven't, I've actually seen them travel a long ways in the evenings to go get that food if their swamp is so good. And a lot of that's based off of human pressure, and I can think of an example years ago where it was like, I couldn't believe I had seen this buck that I knew I was hunting, and I seen him cross the road in front of me, and I had to stop and think, oh my gosh, he's so far. But then like the following day, like I went to check on him in the morning and he was headed right back where it was like the food was so good for him to travel, but his bed was also so good for him to travel, or like he was willing to travel like that. But like I said, that the thing with late season is all going to be dependent on what that ice is doing. Is it going to support them or is it not? And if it's honestly, if it's kind of warmer in the late season, even though that's the opposite of what most, real good late season conditions are, the swamps will hold them longer because that's the thing is like it has to freeze good enough so they're going to vacate it for a little bit. So when they left, like it all depends on what kind of human pressures happen since that, or have they found something better, or like, we keep talking about the water levels. If there's a year that the water levels are really far down and they don't have to walk through that water, like they're never that swamp is like they're going to use that thing all year round, and that goes all the way back to that early season thing. The water levels are down, there almost becomes no edge for them. Now they're deep into that swamp, but yeah, so late season, and I'll be honest, like I mean, no, how it is in Michigan, man. It's usually like November 15th. It totally changes. The one thing that I have seen through trail cameras, a lot of information is you get into this is mainly like December 2nd through the 8th. I've seen this a lot. If you get like kind of that first good snow, so hopefully maybe that swamp waters froze, is some of those scrapes on those islands can be productive again. And I'm guessing that's having to do with like maybe a late doe going in estrus or maybe even a fawn. But I I want to I won't don't be surprised if come the late season if they don't kind of get pushed more towards that outer edge again, depending on what that ice does. The dictates everything to me outside of pressure in the late season, what they're gonna do there.
Awesome, man. Is there anything else? It's so tough on these podcasts, when we
Mhm.
talk about trying to explain what a swamp looks like or tactics in there. And I think really people just have to take it as a starting point and really get in there. You talked about you're going to have to bump some deer at
Mhm.
times, especially if you're moving in on that edge. It's going to happen. And, you know, don't be afraid of it. Like it's a learning opportunity every time it happens. But is there anything else that we can that needs to be given to the listener, or do you think we've covered everything?
No, I would say one more really really important thing about swamps, guys, is you've heard us talk a lot about this hard edge, kind of where that edge is usually where the water line is a lot of times with the swamp. Well, swamps are stagnant, okay? They're mucky, and I would advise anyone to do this if you're starting to hunt swamps. You better start carrying some milkweed with you because the thing about stagnant water, it's usually warm, right? That sun is baking on those swamps all the time. So when it comes to wind and thermals, a lot of these swamps I have, they're not moving water. They just sit still. So they have a lot of pulling power in the evenings when it comes to thermals. And that is, we talked about earlier why that buck is standing there on that buffer on that very edge. Okay. What happens is as the temperature drops in the evening, when the sun starts to go down, starts to cool off, and you got to put your sweatshirt on, that swamp water's still warm. And so it's pulling a lot of scent into that swamp.
Mm.
That's what gives that buck such an advantage on that buffer of that edge. And so you gotta remember that there's a lot of people that talk about what rivers do and what streams and creeks and all that and thermals in hill country. That's why it's a lot of times like I hear guys talk about thermals in hill country, where it's like they talk about, like what the wind does on a leeward side or this and that, or it's like these swamps do the same thing on these edges where the water is like that. They just sit and, swirl right there. Especially like you got to think you could have a wind right in your face. Say you have a south wind and you're on the north side of this swamp, south wind, right? Perfect wind and right in your face. All of a sudden, when that sun goes down and all that, in its flat topography, all of a sudden when that sun goes down, that swamp water is so freaking warm from baking in the sun all day, especially early season. All of a sudden, then your thermals are getting pulled right back to that swamp, and guess who's standing there on the edge? And here's the one thing I'll tell you about a big buck in a swamp is if as long as you don't basically slap him on his ass, and if he figures something's not right, he will not run away. He will simply turn around and quietly walk away. No other animal will really even know if something was wrong there. So that's one thing I would just kind of tell people too is you really have to learn what the thermals do in the swamp because as the season goes on, that water gets colder, so all of a sudden it's November 10th, and you have a really like say if it's a 60-degree day, that swamp water is going to be pushing the scent away because now it's been cold around Halloween, and now it's going to be pushing it away. But yeah, I just want to cover that part real quick. Don't overlook the thermals in a swamp because even though it's flat, they can be tricky.
This is where it's tough if you didn't do the pre-scouting ahead of time to know how those trails run throughout the swamp.
Yep.
Because I would imagine the simple answer is, well, as I get to my stand, I'm dropping milkweed, seeing how it's, well, even then it's going to be different too because as it gets cooler. But as it gets cooler, I'm dropping milkweed, seeing how my wind is being effective. I'm just going to set down on the opposite side of the trail where my wind is being blown away. But he may be coming from that direction too as he's winding through the swamp. So I would say you've done a lot of podcasts on scouting swamps and everybody knows who you are by now. I'm sure. I want to get into your podcast as well, which if anybody listens to mine, they've already listened to yours. But so just to Google your name and it's going to come up all of these really good scouting podcasts that you've done. It is important to do that. We're kind of talking about someone who hasn't had that chance to do that. But the reality is it's going to be tough hunting swamps your first time if you haven't done but still go do it. Don't shy away from it because I think you'll learn if you plan on hunting swamps going forward. Yep. Yeah. Yep.
No, I agree, I started somewhere. You started somewhere. Like everyone's got to start somewhere. And as long as I think, and maybe if you listen to today and you're like, man, that's a lot of years of like trying to learn his craft, where it's like, you just got to get out there, go get dirty, go do it. But think of it like this, think of it in the long term. Like what could it look like 3 years from now? If I got 2 trail cameras and if I'll go set them out on 2 different exit trails and junctions and maybe learn what could those cameras tell me in 3 years and then me hunting it, like what could I tell myself in 3 years, what would I have learned? Well, I've killed a deer. What would I have seen? Or I think that's the big thing is I think if you're a new guy getting into it, kind of think of it as like the long play. Like this is a long play. Like I know we all want results, tomorrow. Like I want my bank account to look totally different tomorrow morning when I wake up. It's just not going to, right? But it's a long play trying to get that to change. And I kind of play that with my hunting too, but I can fully understand for a guy that's just getting into it and kind of wanting results now, like you have to be okay with one failing. Like I don't like to fail, but I'm okay with it, because it's like I always tell my kids this all the time. It's like if I learn something or if you learn something from failing, it's not really a failure in my opinion. So I think you just got to get out there and go get after it and think of it in a long-term game. Like think about down the road what maybe you'll be sitting here talking about swamps.
Yeah, for sure. I wish I could have beat that into the younger version of me. I was so focused on, no, I need to just kill a buck this year right now. And I think it held me back. And so now I'm 47 and I'm thinking long term now, and I'm thinking, okay, and all right, maybe I got 20 years left of being able to do this. And maybe I got 15 years left of doing it at the level that I can do it now. but it's still really important for me to think 3, 4, 5 years down the road now.
Yeah.
I just wish I would have done that when I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
So if you're listening back then and you're thinking, nah, I don't want to listen to these old guys say that. No. You really need to, because, 3 years is going to be here in a blink of an eye, and you'll be so much further ahead. You know?
No, I agree with you, man. I think about that a lot too, because it's like, even like, I think back about, like, let's just say school sports, when you're in school and high school, you just want to, get, don't want to really practice, and you just kind of want to get ready for the games. Or then you get to a certain point when you get older and you're like, dude, I would be the hardest working dude at practice if I could do it all over again. Where it's like, now it's the same concept, right? Where, like, when we talk about scouting and stuff, it's like scouting is the practice, and the, hunting season's the game, where it's like, I would work my ass off all year to be able to get in the game again.
Oh yeah, for sure, man. A lot of shoulda, coulda, wouldas, and
Mm-hmm.
when you get older, I think you finally starts to sink in. You're like, okay, like I'm gonna do it for the future now. So you do have a podcast that I'm sure a few people have heard. It's probably, I said that jokingly, it's like one of the most popular podcasts out there right now. And you've only been doing it for how long now? How many episodes do you have?
So I don't know when this will drop, but I've only got 10 episodes, because I only do an every other week kind of thing. So that's 10 episodes so far, and that's Latitudes, the Method podcast.
Yeah, and it's a awesome podcast. If you guys enjoyed, the deep, like, next level conversation that we had today on some things, I mean, that's what it's like the whole time when you're listening to the Method podcast. It's one that I listen to every time it gets dropped and really enjoy it. I've been listening to every podcast that you've been on for, a couple of years now. And so it's a awesome podcast. How often does it drop? You said it's every other. So how can guys look for it, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah. So it drops every other Wednesday. So, like, right now I got one coming up. It'd be July 10th. So then 2 weeks after that. But you can head on over to, you can find it anywhere on any of the podcast platform, Latitudes, the Method podcast. We have an Instagram page for it. And also you can find it over at latitudeoutdoors.com. It's over there on the homepage, and you can find it there also.
You guys are putting out some of the best stuff out there right now, just in the podcast and with the fall. And then also on the YouTube channel, the hunting videos that are coming out there are just really awesome. So I'm excited to see what you guys are putting out, coming up. And I definitely listen to it every time it drops. So I really appreciate you coming on and being able to share some of that here and with my listeners. And like I said, I'm pretty sure all of them already listen to you. So I don't know if you'll gain any from me, but they'll definitely, maybe one or two.
Man, I appreciate you having me on, and especially talking about swamps here in Michigan. I'm just passionate about it, man. I love it. I'm kind of long-winded. I think that's becomes, part of being passionate, but hopefully someone could get, a little bit of information from this. And if anyone has any questions, just reach out and make sure I talk to anyone that has a question. I started to, and maybe someone that's listening, they have some information for me that I'd love to hear back from. But I really appreciate you having me on, buddy, and keep up the good work over here.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And where can they reach out to you one more time? Where can they find you?
You can find me over at Latitudes, the Method podcast, or my personal or Instagram page is D Riley Jr. You can message me on there also.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming out, and thanks to everybody else for coming out to the dojo. We'll be back next Thursday with another Whitetail Master, and until then, embrace the journey. Well, that is a wrap for us here at the dojo. We'll be back next Thursday with another Whitetail Master. You can also listen to us every Tuesday for our 10-minute Tuesday episode, where I break down a tactic, talk about mindset and personal development, or anything else that might jump in my head in 10 minutes or less. If you like what we are doing here at the dojo, please give us a review. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Mobile Hunters Dojo.